to Prolespod.
Greetings, comrades, and welcome to Prolespod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. I'm your host for today, Jen Big Nasty, of the podcast How the Red Was Won. And in this section of the Stalin Eras series, we will be exploring the period between 1930 and 1934. Just a quick reminder that this discussion is based on the information covered in the previous episode. So if you haven't already listened, please go back and check that out. Alright, here we go. First question. It seems like there are some parallels between the collectivization process in the Soviet Union and the Cultural Revolution in China. Do y'all want to speak about that?
Yeah, so I think that's sort of a for better or for worse sort of situation, like the parallels themselves. To give you, I guess, some groundwork on the Cultural Revolution from specifically the Chinese perspective. In the last few years, I've made personal friends with a number of people who are from China, live in China, do not live here in the West, and therefore, like, that's not the perspective that they're speaking from. So I want to make it clear that this is not like the perspective of immigrants from China, but actual Chinese citizens. Almost universally, the perspective is either that the Cultural Revolution was bad or that the Cultural Revolution was good to some degree or was necessary and therefore, had to be done for one reason or another, but was executed in such a way that it caused damage that was not necessary. Like, and some of that perspective is coming from people who my grandpa had the monopoly of all eggs in China, that sort of person. Some of them were, my grandfather was a member of the intelligentsia and he had a really bad time. So that's somewhat understandable from that perspective. But my friend Qingyang, he comes from a poor family, from a working class family. And his grandmother was a Red Guard, like a teenager, during the Cultural Revolution. And she's now passed away. He's like, but during her lifetime, she would quite often get drunk and then just cry about the things that she saw and the things that she did during the Cultural Revolution. So, like, again, as necessary as the ultimate goal might have been, and as beneficial as the overall results might have been, the execution probably could have been handled better. And of course, this is coming from hindsight. We're able to look back and go, oh, well, this was a mistake and that was a mistake. But as with collectivization, this was the first time something like that had been attempted. And so, of course, it is very, very likely that mistakes were going to be made. Yeah, I guess getting into the actual collectivization process and how there is kind of that similarity. Like, it was so unexpected. Part of the issue was, again, how quickly collectivization happened, as we kind of discussed in the narrative. It happened much more quickly than was expected by the Communist Party or the Central Committee. Even Pravda had to ask Anna Louise Strong for her stories about the Volga region because they had not allocated enough reporters to report on the collectivization process because it went so out of control. Because so many peasants rushed forward to volunteer, to collectivize because it was an appealing prospect to them to get these tractors and these modern farming implements and funding to, do irrigation and whatnot. So there were so many, though, that volunteered that there were not enough tractors or modern farming implements that the state could give to these collective farms. So they had to end up buying tractors from the Ford Motor Company to cover the deficit. But that was additional cost to the 5-year plan, which was not accounted for, which meant that they then had to cancel trade agreements with other nations. Like cotton imports were cut to almost nothing, which resulted in like another year of Soviet citizens being asked to do without fresh clothing because they just didn't have enough to manufacture enough for everybody to get more. And also, like Moscow, one of the sort of random pieces of fallout from this was that Moscow had agreed to purchase tons of coffee beans from Brazil, but because they had to buy tractors from Ford, they couldn't do that. And they backed out on that trade agreement, which kind of made an enemy, like, you've made an enemy for life, like that kind of a situation with Brazil. On the flip side, the city of Kharkiv chose to build a tractor manufacturing plant in order to kind of do its part. But because it was what they called outside of the plan, because it was not part of the initial 5-year plan, they couldn't get funding from the central state. They had to pay for it all themselves. The city had to pay for it all themselves. And so they were basically just asking their citizens to volunteer their free time and their holidays to build a fucking factory so that they could assist with the collectivization process, which is pretty incredible. And again, kind of like we discussed in the narrative, again, for better or for worse, the collectivization process was very much a bottom-up process. It was decided much more at the local level than it was by the Central Committee or Stalin. And I do think that there are ups and downsides to that. Anna Louise Strong, when she's out there, when she's talking about the difficulties that are going on, her friend Perchik is like, hey, this is a situation of the right wing in the party arguing that we should go slower and the main force of the party saying we need to go faster. But because of that, there's some kind of confusion in the way that the policy is being communicated. And she's like, oh shit, I didn't even like really think about that. She has kind of this revelation about democratic centralism where it's like, if you have confusion at the top, it's going to create chaos on the ground. And it left room for these kind of activist officials at the local level to commit excesses, to prosecute people who were maybe not guilty, or it opened up the opportunity for peasants who just didn't like their neighbor to be like, oh, that dude's a fucking kulak, let's get him out of here. That kind of stuff, because there wasn't a clear set of policy there. And I guess, again, we are speaking with the benefit of hindsight, and we can go, this could have been done better and that could have been done better. I think the one thing we can sort of definitely say is that a more defined line from the beginning probably would have helped that, and a way, again, because they didn't anticipate the peasants rushing to collectivize. They kind of were like, it's going to be difficult to convince them to collectivize. So we've got to, like, we're just going to do as much as we can. We're going to allow as many people as want to collectivize in as many regions as they want to. I think having an upper limit cap, or perhaps going region by region, also would have been a beneficial way to handle that process. But again, this is me speaking from the 21st century with all of this modern insight that they did not have. They were doing this. Tony's fucking plane metaphor kind of applies here on collectivization.
Yeah, I think that oddly enough, that there was an underestimation of how much bitterness the peasantry, like the poor peasants, had towards the kulaks. And so when they had been waiting for years for this to happen, basically for them to get their due, essentially. And once they were like given the green light, they were just like, they just went ham. And, and bearing in mind, they had every reason to, right? They had been like persecuted, hurt, like sabotaged by the rich peasants. But yeah, it was rough. I think about like the example that I gave in the discussion that we had at the end of part 1 about the guy who, and this goes, I guess it ties in with collectivization, but not really. The Cultural Revolution was widespread throughout all areas of the society. But about the guy who was in the Komsomol that would go, volunteered to go basically teach peasants how to read and write, that he's doing like on his days off every week. So he's working all week and then going on his days off to go teach. But it wasn't all great. And so another anecdote I'll tell is that in 1932, there was he was a son of a kulak who had been essentially, they had seized his family's land through his dad in the gulag. And then he and his mom came to the city to, work in the factories, which is what a lot of folks did, especially after mechanization hit the rural areas, because there was like a surplus of labor, right? All these people that had been working the fields were no longer necessary because of all the tractors and stuff like that. And so they were like not getting any kind of work. They were working like 2 or 3 hours a day. And so a lot of them, basically had to move to the city. And that created a whole nother crisis, which created the introduction of the passport, the internal passport system, which was introduced in 1930. Anyway, this guy, he's a young guy in his early 20s. He's working in a factory in 1932. And he kind of, in his diary, he is going through this crisis where he's like basically trying to fight his past, like his kulak nature. And as a result, he tends to project some. But he says, quote, "I got into a conversation with Suvorov, and he declared, quote, 'I've come here to earn money and equip myself,' end quote. There it is, the peasant's psychology. Sees only his personal gain and believes only in himself. The new kolkhozs are educating people. I just had a thought. Perhaps Suvorov is a kulak henchman sent here to demoralize the workers. Anything is possible." Right? So, like, this is the kind of mentality that has permeated the population, especially the enthusiastic population.
Yeah. And in terms of, and this is actually more related to, I guess it's secondarily or tertiarily related to collectivization, is when the famine started to kick off in 1931, 1932, there were all of these different competing explanations for why it happened or why people were starving or dying or whatever. The Western press was like, "Oh, this is proof that collectivization is bad, and this is the reason that it happened." And left-wing elements in the West and in the Soviet Union were like, "Oh, it's because the kulaks burned all of the fields and killed all the livestock." And then Anna Louise Strong has her own opinion that because she was on the ground there and she saw there was corruption, that it was, "Oh, this is bad management here on the local level, that these greedy local commissars who are stealing grain or whatever, things like that, then this is why that happened." But Stalin and so Anna Louise Strong married a Russian man in the early 30s. For them, the responsibility was on the party. It was on the party to have not, it's not these peasants on the ground. It's not the kulaks. It's not the local officials. It is the responsibility of the party as the people who are there to guide the nation to make sure that these things don't happen. And if they do happen, although these individuals might hold some individual responsibility, it was the overall policy that was put forth by the party, which is ultimately responsible for the failures of collectivization. Or if people are, starving, it's because too much grain was taken away from these peasants, or it wasn't distributed fairly. And some of this, there were also policy issues as well related to the way collections were done. Again, Stalin himself was like, "No, it's us. We're the ones who are responsible for this because we're the ones in charge."
My first question is maybe one that is more broad, and also I'm curious how it is in the Soviet Union in this context and this time period. But like, what is the significance? So we came in swinging with the comparison between the Soviet Union and China, but like, what is the significance theoretically on aggregate for a cultural revolution? Also, I feel like Tony is going to have some input on this because I've listened to episodes on Tony's other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism, where this may or may not have come up in Tony's other podcast. Because we come in and we see what it was and how it was implemented. But I think that it's really, really difficult for Westerners, especially, to understand the context in which they live and to understand the nature of the ongoing construct of culture, regardless of where you live. And so I think it's like, can you make it make sense for somebody who maybe doesn't know what that might do?
I have, so I think yes. So as we can tell, particularly in the south of the United States of America, there still exists a very stubborn, very persistent, like racist, quasi fascist mentality among large swaths of the population. And the reason that that still exists decades later is because there was never a cultural revolution, right? There was no rising up of, youth or enlightened folks in the South that were, that came to the forefront and were like, no, destroying these old monuments and, burning the textbooks and whatever, right? There was no cultural pushback. It was basically a concession to integrate and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that that's kind of the context of it and the necessity for a cultural revolution.
And I would say that the collectivization process was kind of a cultural revolution in and of itself because, as Stalin argued, the peasants have an individualist mindset, and the only thing that's going to break them out of that individualist mindset is either to proletarianize them, so to get them into working productive labor, not farming, or to get them onto a collective farm where their thought process is not what can I do for me, but what can we do together to do better for us as a group. So even though it's not, the focus was not on let's change the culture of the peasants, that was a secondary part of the collectivization process because it did proletarianize a whole bunch of peasants and also brought them together into a kind of collectivist unity through the kolkhoz or even to a lesser degree the artel.
And what do you guys think that we can learn from this? Because I think that there's something unique about, and we see this also with women, children, the reconceptualization of the family, that there is inherently, right? This is not on the part of the Soviets, this is not specifically on the part of Stalin, but there is inherently a limitation of what it is for people to be leading or guiding or facilitating a cultural revolution who have, by definition, never seen what is going to be on the other side of that. And what do you think are like the key wins? What do you think are the losses? I know you've spoken to some of them already, but like what gets lost when those who are guiding or facilitating the revolution, in this case the party, do not have firsthand experience of what the alternative is, or in the case of the peasants, have mostly never been peasants or rural agricultural workers?
Well, so there was a push in the early 30s for Soviet citizens to write diaries in order to, I guess, create like the new soul of man or whatever, right? Because the party and the party members were all very excited, very optimistic about what was happening, but because they had never done it before, there was a necessity for them to figure out how they were going to do that. And so that was one of the things that they did, right? And one of the other results of that same exact thing was the media, right? How do you create plays, movies, poems, books that reflect socialist ideology while kind of transforming the people into the mentality that would be needed in order to build a socialist country and not backslide into individualism? And so I think one of the costs of that was that there was constant backpedaling and changing, right? So they would put forward a resolution, this is what's going to happen. And then a couple years later, they're like, shit, this isn't working. So then they got to like try something else, right? And that kind of led to a lot of confusion as to like, okay, what are we doing now? And particularly because at this point in the history of the Soviet Union, the writers were almost exclusively from the petty bourgeois and the intelligentsia of the Tsarist era. And so trusting them to tell stories was something that was very difficult for the party to handle. And particularly Stalin, he never really trusted them to do it, which is why he would constantly write like critiques of plays and movies and stuff in the press, like so that he could, I guess, show people how he was feeling about it, right?
Yeah, so I'm just going to jump in here with a little bit of comparative history, bring that into our discussion. I think both Jeremy and Justin have highlighted quite well in both the narrative and in your answers now the criticisms and the issues that played out with the implementation of rapid industrialization and collectivization. But I think it's also important to note that when it comes to the violence, the death, and the harm that was caused by these incredible systemic changes, I want to bring up a book that's called The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel, who I believe is a liberal scholar. And this book came out a few years ago. And in it, he explains through giving an overview of the material realities of human history going back to the Stone Age to the present, that the greatest forms of equality have only, and like he argues very firmly, his thesis is that the greatest forms of equality have only come from either mass mobilization warfare, state collapse, transformative revolutions, or catastrophic plagues, which to some degree, all of those are actually at play during the 1920s in the Soviet Union and, of course, into the early 30s. So I just want to clarify that this isn't the issues arising from this time period aren't just a socialism problem, but really are a product of this confluence of material conditions.
Yeah.
And to further kind of, I guess, bring about another comparative analysis here, a comparative historical analysis, is that if we look at the emergence of capitalism in the West, industrialization, and the moving away from feudalism, we all know that that was based on mass slavery, genocide, and of course, that criticism gets made. Everyone knows it, but what often doesn't get mentioned is that today our modern economic global system is based still on the grinding down of the global South continuously, right? Certainly, what happened during the rapid industrialization and collectivization of farming the Soviet Union was brutal. I mean, that's undeniable. But that was only during a specific period of the Soviet Union's history, and it ended, right? But today, that is still going on in the global South.
I mean, and in the imperial core with like incarcerated populations,
True.
with
Yes.
displaced indigenous people. I mean, it continues to happen within and without the core.
Right. And unlike the capitalist mode of production and imperialism and slavery and genocide, there's nothing good that comes out at the end of that, right? Like the Cultural Revolution and the collectivization process in the Soviet Union, although they did cause a lot of distress and bad things, terrible things happened within the context of those events, great things resulted afterward. The ability, again, like Justin made the point in the narrative, that the only way that the Red Army was able to feed itself and survive during the Great Patriotic War is because of the massive increase in grain production and foodstuff, agriculture in general during this period. Collectivization is the only reason that happened.
Yeah. And so another, I guess to go back a little bit, another example of the backpedaling that they were forced to kind of do, kind of a funnier one, I guess, is that when they started conceptualizing socialist art, they felt like the artists, the writers, etc., would be able to produce better work if they lived in essentially villages together in comfortable houses. And so they, set up these like writer villages essentially. And then after a while, they were like, wait a minute, like the comfort actually creates like discontent. The isolation with each other creates like counter-revolutionary discussion essentially. Because they're completely disconnected from the workers and the common people. And so that was like another kind of like weird, funny anecdote as far as going back on your plan. But again, they were doing what the fuck they could.
So maybe before we go on to the next question, Justin, you'd mentioned that in the American South, you have the understanding that there wasn't, of course, there wasn't a cultural revolution that occurred after the ending of slavery. From what I understand, Reconstruction was a process which at least had the stated goal of trying to fix some of both the economic and social issues at the time. Jen, I know you operate out of the Deep South, so I was wondering if you have anything to say to that, because I don't know much about, the Reconstruction period at all.
That
But
was
yeah, good to
actually
know.
something I took a note on. I liked
Perfect.
this comment about the ongoing construct of culture, how this is something that continues and evolves, and it's not just a one-time thing, but it's something that has to keep being like worked towards. And that, yeah, the early ending of Reconstruction in the southern United States, I think most people agree that that was a failure, and that it leads to a lot of the issues we have down here right now, and the need for a cultural revolution in the southern United States, because without that, if you want to call it re-education of the, specifically like the white people down here, they've been able to hold on to these old racist outdated ideals, and they cling to that flag. They cling to what they like to call heritage, which I guess in a way it is, but they cling to it in unhealthy ways that continue oppression of racialized people, but also of women, of immigrants, of anybody that isn't just a white person down here. Half of my family came to Texas in like the 70s. My mom's family's from Vietnam, and she even remembers as a child like going to the grocery store in the South and being like her family being told to go back home, and all that stuff, right? And that stuff continues to this day. So yeah, we definitely need some sort of cultural revolution, and not just the South. All
No,
of the United States could really use a swift kick
For
in the
sure.
yeah,
ass,
yeah,
forced
Yeah,
re-education.
another great example would be like the so-called gay rights movement, right? So
Hmm.
they fought, they got equality supposedly with hiring and all that kind of stuff, and then that was the end of it,
Hmm.
And then to this day,
Right.
we still just have rampant like anti-LGBT like actions.
Yeah, and that's a failure of liberalism in a
right.
lot of ways, is that liberals think that saying the right thing makes it all better,
Yeah,
right? We gave you a black president. Is that not enough?
Hmm.
right.
Whereas it doesn't actually solve those contradictions that are like developed into our society.
Yeah, and I guess to like draw a direct parallel, if if the United States were the Soviet Union, the politicians that were in the South would have never been allowed to continue to be politicians at all. And
Right.
instead they shored up different ways to get around the laws, and then now you've got, a ban on abortion, and you've got, textbooks in the schools that teach all kinds of bullshit, and
Hmm.
none of that would have ever been allowed.
Hmm. In Western historical telling, the early 1930s quote unquote show trials are a sort of precursor to the more high profile trials related to the Great Purge. And it's said that they were staged or built on forced confessions. What is the evidence that y'all have found to the contrary? Or what's the basis for your understanding that these trials were actually genuine?
Yeah, so I address some of this in the narrative, and I can get into some more here. I guess for like anecdotal evidence, the leader of the industrial party trials, Professor Rasman, he was at the end of the trial, he was sentenced to death, which I mentioned, and then they appealed, and it got knocked down to a 10-year prison sentence, which at the time was the maximum that they could do. But it should be noted, and this is consistent like across Soviet history. So this idea of like, I don't know, like oppression and stuff like that is very backwards. But he ended up going on to like get won over, I guess, by the Soviet system once he was out of prison. And in 1943, he was actually awarded the Order of Lenin and the Joseph Stalin Prize, which gets you $30,000 for the invention of like a turbo generator, which was said to be one of the best in the world at the time. And that is true, again, of a lot of the other people that were imprisoned. They would get out and go on to live perfectly content lives. Like they were reintegrated, unlike, in the US where you get out of prison and then you're fucked for the rest of your life.
Right. And that is, I guess this is not an episode or a question about gulags, but it is very important to remember that the gulags were part of obviously was paying your debt to society. You were made to work, but you were also paid prevailing wages. Whatever job you were doing there in the gulag, you received a full wage, which you could then send back to your family, help them to live back home, or you could save it all up and have it when you get out of the gulag. But it was also the secondary aspect to the gulag was re-education. The whole fucking point was for you to get trained on getting your mind right. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, like obviously when some of these people got out of there, they were changed people because they had received a brand new education.
Yeah. And I think it was Molotov. He talks about how people in retrospect look back and they're like, oh, like, look at all these women and children that were sent to the gulag. And he says, like, we didn't send them there to persecute them. We sent them there because it's hard for people to live without their families. And we wanted to allow, like, if they chose, and it was a choice, to be able to stay like close to their families, which I thought is like an interesting kind of, I guess, anecdote. You know, I guess another thing, which I said in the narrative, but I think it bears retelling, that the people in the Metro Vickers trial, every single one of them, when they got back to their home countries, they were constantly bombarded with like leading questions from the press, asking them like, oh, why would you confess to something you didn't do? Like, did they torture you? Blah, blah, blah. And without fail, they were like, no, they didn't torture us. Like, we gave these voluntarily. They actually treated us really well. So, you know, again, like, why would they confess to something that didn't exist? And I'll get back to that, I guess, in a minute. But another anecdote I have is from the Croatian communist leader of who ended up being the leader of the fascist movement in Croatia. He ended up getting gulagged. He got purged and then gulagged for 10 years. And when he was in prison, was in the late 30s. And so there were still some of these people in prison. And he tells a story about one of the people that got sent to prison. And he says, quote, "The young fellow's story struck me not only because of its outspokenness against the government, which would be weird in prison, right? Because they're constantly being guarded, but also and particularly because of his detailed account of the espionage and sabotage organization." And this is in regards, again, I believe it was Metro Vickers. According to him, the affair was far more sensational than has been made public by the court proceedings. The government, he thought, did not want too many revelations and deliberately conducted it as a wrecker's case, whereas it was in fact a real conspiracy. He asserted that the organization had a complete plan to plunge the whole of Moscow into darkness at a moment's notice and blow up the Kremlin and other strategically important points in the town by means of some mysterious rays, which is weird. I'm assuming he means like bombs or something. The blowing up of the Kremlin would result in the overthrow of the government and its replacement by one composed of specialist technicians, and this was the actual conspiracy that was charged. Only by means of modern technique and only with the aid of technical specialists can the communists be overthrown, the young fellow declared. And he says, repeating one of the cliches fairly widespread in Soviet circles, which is again a reference to the intelligentsia or the specialist technicians. The conspiracy had apparently been exposed quite accidentally. One of the chief engineers, while taking some papers from the safe in his office, had inadvertently dropped a map of Moscow with the points to be blown up marked on it, in front of the nose of a communist who happened to be there. According to the student, he himself was a close relative of one of the principal accused, but had contrived to escape immediately after the first arrests had taken place. With false papers, he had managed to get taken on a shipbuilding yard on the Baikal and thought that having traveled so far, he would not be in danger. However, after 6 months, he was traced and arrested. Blah, 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 blah. So this tells me, like, this story, I guess, anecdotal, of course, but before the conspiracy was uncovered as far as the late trials are concerned, certainly the Moscow trials, that there was already, like, conspiratorial work going on in the background behind these. And I think that there is a misconception that these trials, which were public, are like a murder trial or something, right? But they weren't murder trials, they were conspiracy trials. And in the US, we also have conspiracy trials. And in those conspiracy trials, you are in no way admitted press access. You're not admitted to see the evidence. You're not, like, none of it, right? They do this in a military tribunal and they convict them behind closed doors, and that's the end of it. And this is much the same way. And I think that they don't want to produce evidence publicly because they don't want the people that are still a member of these conspiracies to be able to be like, ah, shit, they got us here, here, and here. Let's make sure we don't do that anymore, right? And so I think that that's like one of the biggest, I guess, misconceptions. As far as evidence is concerned, there's actually, ironically, more evidence that we've uncovered for the Moscow trials and the military conspiracy trials than these, probably because there's more interest in it, right? So nobody has really, I think, dug into the archives to find the evidence that they presented to the defendants in order to get them to confess. But it should be noted that from the arrest to the sentencing was 9 days. So they didn't have time to prepare these like complex confession statements and internalize them and memorize them and all kinds of shit like that. They certainly didn't have time to torture them to the point of confession, where they also wouldn't be noticed by the press in the trial. So it is kind of silly to me.
And again, I cannot express how valuable Anna Louise Strong's diaries are for this shit, because again, like you might you can be like, oh well, that shit was all part of the Bolshevik conspiracy. They were able to fabricate all this stuff, but Strong has got no motivation to. She was under no obligation to publish this book, her diaries, which were published in the 1970s. She was just keeping these records like for herself. The government wasn't telling her what to say. She wasn't creating propaganda for the outside. It wasn't written with the intent to publish it. It was published decades, 40 years, more than 40 years after her experiences in the Soviet Union. But at one point, she's kind of touring. She's told by the newspaper that she's working for that she should go and tour around and meet American workers and get their perspective on what it's like to work in the Soviet Union as an American. And one of the people that she meets is this guy who has 20 years of experience in a foundry. And this is a direct quote by him. He says, "When I first came here, there were 2 gangs in this plant. One gang was making tractors. The other gang was preventing them. Think I don't know sabotage when I see it? I've seen it in the States when companies were at war. I didn't know where to go to complain. You might talk to the wrong person. But I saw what they did to those machines. Once, they broke the water pipes. Once, they plugged the drain with rags. Next, they burned out the motor by throwing it on full charge at once." So he ends up finding somebody he feels like he can trust, and he reports on it. And he says, "They put a special guard on that machine, and we got it going. Little by little, they seemed to catch those guys. At first, the shop was loaded with them, but boy, oh boy, they took them out of here." So like, this is an American worker, not some like fucking paid shill. Again, this is in her diary entries. And in fact, a lot of the stories that she's telling from this period are kind of about how Americans and their Russian bosses are not getting along very well. And in fact, this guy mentions the fact that he has a hard time relating to and getting what he needs from his Russian boss. But he still is like, yeah, these motherfuckers were wrecking shit here. So this is on the ground, firsthand accounting from an unbiased source of industrial sabotage taking place. So yeah, I strongly believe this shit is legit.
And yeah, and Strong is a good resource, especially because she was kicked out of the Soviet Union in the 50s because they suspected her of being a spy. So she had every reason to like not want to promote this era, but still was willing to like put out these stories. And another journalist, Walter Duranty, he tells the same story. There's a mine where he says that one of the workers was telling a story about how they were intentionally sabotaging stuff. And he said he had seen it with his own eyes. He says either they were, I can't remember the exact words, I don't have the quote in front of me, but it's like either they were complete idiots or they were wreckers, right? So those stories are, and it makes total sense. There's this weird idea among the Western left that after the revolution, which a revolution requires incredible united front type work, right? Every person that you can get to maybe be on your side, you have to have on your side. The idea that a decade later, none of these guys are going to want to oppose the Soviet system when it's essentially in crisis is just crazy, right? Absolutely crazy.
Yeah, I wanted to make 2 points here. The first is in regards to, and this is something that still happens today, of course, but when Westerners are looking at the Soviet Union or any other socialist country, they have this kind of like assumption that what they're seeing is fake in some way, right? And I guess one could call it capitalist realism, where they're just kind of assuming that if it's not capitalist, if it's not coming from a capitalist society or perspective, then it can't be real because capitalism is the only thing that's true. And we see this, of course, when it comes today to countries like North Korea. People go on tours there and they assume everyone's an actor, everything is staged, and people are robots there, essentially, right? The second thing I wanted to point to in regards to the trials was thinking about judicial systems and justice, right? We're talking about the 1930s here. Again, no plane metaphors this episode, but I'm on this kind of comparative history kick here, right? So if we're looking at the 1930s in the US, for example, the justice system there, what's going on, right? Rampant injustice towards African Americans and other marginalized groups, right? I think it's 1931, the Scottsboro Boys trial is taking place, right? Where it was like 9 African American teenagers, I believe, were accused of raping a white woman when they didn't, but they were all sentenced to death on the flimsiest piece of evidence that existed, right? So it's almost like the Soviet Union gets portrayed when talking about these trials as if, even assuming that the trials were like totally bullshit or whatever and based on false evidence, that this was happening in every other world system towards marginalized people.
I mean, 20 years later, there were still lynchings in the US. So, like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
There are currently still lynchings in the US.
Well, yes. Yeah, like traditional, like mobs,
True.
like hanging people from trees and shit.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, something to bear in mind is that, like, when we were talking about the South and how particularly bad it is, the only reason the North is better is that the violence is outsourced to the fucking police instead of individualized private citizen violence.
Mm-hmm. So one of the stated goals of this series is to humanize Joseph Stalin. Can y'all give us some little stories or anecdotes that might provide some clarity as to who he was as a person?
Yeah. So I've got a few quotes from various sources, I guess, to begin with, and then I got a pretty good story, I think. So Latvian Bolshevik revolutionary Wilhelm Kanorin said of Stalin, quote, "He is the target of our enemies, and they are quite right to make him so," end quote. Hungarian revolutionary Bela Kun said...
Who got purged later.
He did get purged later. He said, "He knows how to not go too quickly. He knows how to weigh the moment," end quote. German-Swiss biographer Emil Ludwig asked Stalin, quote, "Do you think you can be compared to Peter the Great?" end quote. And Stalin responds, quote, "Historical comparisons are always hazardous, but that one is absurd," end quote. So I guess speaking to those three quotes, he is really important to the Soviet Union. He is the center of the life, I guess not even just of the Soviet Union, of the larger communist world, I suppose, not just within the actually existing socialist countries, but in places where the revolution has yet to take place. And then also that quote from the where he's responding to Emil Ludwig, for a person who supposedly loved this cult of personality that was built around him, he tends to respond in extremely humble ways when somebody tries to give him a compliment. I remember reading in History and Critique of a Black Legend, the Lacerdo book, where somebody suggests that actually we should probably call Marxism-Leninism Stalinism. And Stalin laughs and he's like, no. He's like, that's like comparing a dick to a guard tower. He's like, my contribution is nothing compared to Marx and Lenin.
To that Peter the Great quote there, because as you've already mentioned, Stalin has these zingers, right? These zinger quotes that are awesome. I was hoping he was going to respond to that Peter the Great question by saying, "Peter who?" But oh well.
No, yeah, but I guess continuing on, Barbus writes that Stalin regularly goes to bed at 4:00 in the morning. He has only one secretary. He does not sign what other people write, but that does not prevent him from replying or having replies sent to every letter he receives. So he is very much interested in making sure that whatever he asks other people to do, or whatever he comes to a decision with the Central Committee to ask other people to do, he is willing to do himself. He's not going to be like, hey, we need to be working as hard as we possibly can, and then go and fucking hang out in a villa somewhere. He is boots on the ground kind of dude. But kind of speaking to that letter situation, on that note, I have another great story from Anna Louise Strong. So starting in the early 1920s, she tried to get off the ground an English language newspaper, which could be distributed to English-speaking workers within the Soviet Union, but also sent abroad to be shared with American and English workers elsewhere. But she had like an immense amount of difficulty getting anyone to listen to her on this in the early 20s. It was very difficult for her to find any publishing house within the Soviet Union who was willing to do it, any bureaucrat who was willing to engage with her on the subject. But finally, in the late 20s, she has this like experience, and I discussed it in the discussion of episode 1, but she's accused of being a Trotskyist. And it's because she had written an article for Hearst newspapers and sent it back to them. And the editor had taken advantage of the growing rift between Trotsky and Stalin and, socialism in one country and permanent revolution to basically edit her article and take out positive things that she said about Stalin and add in paragraphs which were critical of the 5-year plan. And once that was resolved, then it was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, you can write a newspaper. But she still had problems because the bureaucrats who were in charge of publishing this paper were fixated on a Russian perspective of the Soviet Union, and the American style of humor and writing and level of interest was different. And so they would quite often edit jokes out because they were like, this is anti-communist. And she was like, well, no, this is we're exaggerating for effect because that's like, whatever, that's an American way of dealing with this. But they also had to send it to a secondary editor who would censor things because they're like, okay, well, we don't want you to talk about that. And then eventually they started basically giving her articles to publish in this paper that were heavy theory-based stuff. And she was like, this isn't what these American workers working here in the Soviet Union want to read. They want to know what's going on around the Soviet Union so they understand what their part is in the big picture. Anyway, she's having all of these problems, and she is complaining to her friend about all of these difficulties that she's having. And her friend is like, just write a letter to Stalin about it. And she's like, what? And he's like, no, just write a letter to Stalin. I mean, the worst he's going to do is say, sorry, I can't help you with this. But yeah, go ahead and do it. So she writes a letter to Stalin that's like, look, I don't understand what's going on here, but and the sort of the last straw was, she's like, I didn't mind really writing articles for the newspaper. She's like, but they had my name on here as editor. She's like, but I had no editorial control. So I asked them to take my name off of it. And the bureaucrat who was in charge of the publication was like, if you take your name off of that, you're committing anti-Soviet actions. And so she writes this in the letter to Stalin, and he's like, come on down, meet with me and a couple of the comrades. And she's like, what the fuck? So she goes to the Kremlin and she goes through this like process, and she's like, I'm not really going to be meeting Stalin though, right? Like, I'm going to be meeting his secretary or one of his underlings or whatever. But no, she goes in, and it's fucking Stalin, Kaganovich, and Voroshilov. They're all there to talk about this. And the 2 bureaucrats that she's been working with are also there. So Stalin like turns to the guy who was like, you can't take your name off it. And he's like, quote, how does it happen that the comrade here complains that you give her no authority on the paper, yet insist on retaining her name and call it an anti-Soviet act if she takes it off? Why is it necessary to use such violence? End quote. And Strong thinks to herself, she's like, direct like that. I even felt sorry for Vaxov. But Vaxov and his connection to the Central Committee, Gusev, had agreed that Strong could remove her name, but only the night before. And Voroshilov laughs, and he's like, quote, when was this agreed? Last night? After we began to investigate? So like they start like sweating a little bit because they're like, oh shit, we were kind of mostly doing this as a result of this letter that she sends. But she's like, no, actually, this is fine. I'm actually good with this. I could take my name off. And Stalin's like, there's nothing more that you want? Nothing more? And he ends up talking through with this bureaucrat. Look, she seems like a good comrade. She seems like she is doing what she is supposed to do. If it turns out that she's engaging in bullshit, you'll figure that out pretty quickly. Why not give her some more freedom? Let her do what she wants to do. Again, sort of the opposite of the perspective we generally have of Stalin as sort of this dictatorial, like, oh my God, don't you dare step out of line. And he also says, because again, another one of the pushes was to try to get theory published in these English language papers. But Stalin says, quote, if they stay long enough with us, they will learn Russian and get their theory from Russian papers, which are, and then he pauses and he's like, very full of it, end quote. And Strong again thinks to herself, quote, what? He knew the weariness of theory for people just learning to analyze. He knew the dullness of long arguments, end quote. And then sort of the final thought that she has is, quote, not very imposing for such an important man, end quote. She talks about how good Stalin was at reading people, that he adjusted his approach when speaking to different people who were there in the room with them. He was firm with Vaksov. He was a little bit more joking and humorous with Gusev. So he was able to read people and know what the best approach was to get through to them, what he was trying to get across. Something else that Strong says about Stalin is, quote, men never asked for Stalin's will or Stalin's orders as they did with personal dictators. They asked, what is Stalin's analysis? The Soviet Union was the only country where this function of analyst ranked highest. Why? Because it was the only country that really sought to release a great mass will.
I just like this anecdote of Stalin being good at code switching as needed. Funny when he needs to be funny, more intellectual when he needs to be intellectual. That is very humanizing, very cool.
I did want to kind of mention something I don't think we've mentioned too much in the series thus far, is Stalin's family life.
Right.
So at this point in the early 30s, Stalin actually he's married, of course, to his second wife, Nadezhda, I believe is how you pronounce it. His first wife having died in the early 1900s, 1906, I believe it was. So right now he has 4 children. The first from his first wife, his name is Yakov. And then from his current wife at this time, he has 2 children, a boy named Vasily and a girl named Svetlana. And they're both young children, 10, 11, 12, 13-ish. And what I found was interesting is that he actually has a 4th child too. And this is a child that he had adopted. One of his comrades unfortunately passed away, or was potentially murdered, I guess, during the Civil War, perhaps by Trotsky, as some have theorized. And Stalin actually adopted his comrade's son. And I won't get into it too much this episode, but I think next episode I'll be delving into his family life a little bit more than we have.
Yeah, no, that is something that Barbusse talks about as well, that he was very concerned about the welfare of children that were kind of in his, sphere of influence and making sure that they were taken care of. Yeah, I guess, I don't know. To address the opposite of Stalin, Trotsky, Strong says of him, quote, Trotsky refused to listen. He was so determined to impress his own ideas on people that he never tried to know what they really wanted, end quote. So as a counterpoint to Stalin, who was very interested in understanding people, understanding what they wanted, drawing on that to then make determinations of how to proceed. She's like, Trotsky was just fucking, here's what I want. Y'all are going to accept it or I'm going to cry about it and undermine the Soviet Union.
Every 8 minutes, a group of friends somewhere says, we should totally make this into a podcast. Each year, thousands of podcasts are rescued from obscurity by generous patrons like you. But for millions of others, help comes too late. Hi, I'm Ray. Will you be an angel for a helpless podcaster? Every day, we at the Proles are slaving away over a hot mic crying out for help. Please go to patreon.com/Prolespod to pledge your monthly gift right now. For just $5 a month, 16 cents a day, you'll rescue working class podcasters and help to provide us with food, shelter, recording equipment, rare and wildly expensive books, and love. Join online in the next 30 minutes to receive access to bonus episodes, exclusive interviews, live listening parties, theory beats, and more. You will also have the satisfaction of knowing that a podcaster has been given a second chance, thanks to you. Right now, there is a podcaster who needs you. Your monthly subscription at patreon.com/Prolespod says, I'm here to help. Please join right now.
What are some of the critiques or contradictions that come to light during this period of time? Both genuine contradictions and maybe some that don't really have a material basis.
Well, so one of the weird little, what I would consider fake contradictions, which crops up during this time, at least from the perspective of the West, is the belief that the Soviet Union was going to make everyone equal by flattening everyone down, turning it into like a communist anthill, I think is how Anna Louise Strong puts it. It's like that really bad Kurt Vonnegut short story, Harrison Bergeron, where anyone who is better than average at something is given an artificial handicap to make them average. Like, it's goofy individualist bullshit. Like, I love Kurt Vonnegut, but that story sucks. But that's how a lot of people, beginning in the early 30s, but really right on to today, see the Soviet Union as they were trying to make everybody equal, and if you were really good, then they would flatten you down and make sure that you didn't outperform the people who sucked. But I've got a couple of quotes here. The first is by Barbusse. Quote, "The communist internationalists are in favor of national expansion on the sole condition that it is not obtained by war and is not put into the hands of so-called businessmen. Their theory of the great suppression of private property only harms a negligible number of social parasites and profiteers, and it brings with it enormous benefit to all the other inhabitants of the earth. As for leveling, they are its avowed enemies as soon as it goes beyond that great law of justice and equity, the basis, in fact, of socialism, which consists in giving each human being precisely the same political power, that is to say, in effacing the artificial and pernicious inequality on the threshold of destiny. It would be easy to show that socialism is, of all regimes, the one which cultivates individuality the most and the best. This is in contrast with the pathological hypertrophy of certain individual monopolies." So basically, this was written in 1934, so the language is a bit difficult, I guess. But he's basically saying here that the function of the socialist project in the Soviet Union is to make sure that, regardless of the magical events which resulted in your birth, the destiny that you received, that you have absolutely no control of, you are given the same political power as anybody else. You can't be born into wealth and therefore have a better chance at success than somebody else. But they're not there to go, okay, well, this person over here is really good at making flywheels, and this person over here is not as good, so we're going to make this guy over here who is really good at making them work slower, so he's going to be at the same level of performance as this other guy. Like, that's not a real thing that went on in the Soviet Union. Stalin also says, quote, "By equality, Marxism does not mean the leveling of personal requirements and conditions of existence, but the suppression of classes. That is to say, equal enfranchisement for every worker after the overthrow and expropriation of the capitalists, the equal duty of everyone to work according to their capacity, and the equal right of all workers to be remunerated according to the work they do. Socialist society. or the equal duty of everyone to work according to their capacity and the equal right of all workers to be remunerated according to their needs, communist society. Marxism starts from the fact that the needs and tastes of individuals can never be alike nor equal in quality or quantity, either in the socialist or the communist era. End quote. So again, like, not everybody has the same needs, not everybody has the same capacity to work, but everybody has the right to be paid, essentially, for the work that they do under a socialist society or under a communist society based on their actual needs. And not everybody's needs are the same, so that remuneration is not going to be the same for every single person, nor would communists or socialists ask it to be. Or as Anna Louise Strong puts it, quote, equality was a word to make men vague, like God and truth, like freedom, like all of those words of ideals, like the bluffing words of my youth that covered smoothly a dozen conflicting meanings, end quote. Yeah, equality can mean very different things to different people, but there is nowhere that the Soviet Union or socialists argue that everyone is to be made equal outside of, again, what are their needs and what is their ability to do work.
My counterpoint to that is that my 7th grade teacher, in fact, a social studies teacher, in fact, told me that everyone in the Soviet Union got paid the exact same salary.
Wow. Haven't you read 1984?
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's the whole diary thing is one, right? The laboratory of the soul, as they called it, right? They're encouraging individualism, right? To further your individual self. There is the Stakhanovite movement, which comes up in the late 30s, which is another great example of highlighting individuals. Throughout the history of the Soviet Union, they gave awards, usually large cash rewards, for people that set themselves apart as, like, exemplary of their particular union or whatever. I think that's just like such a silly thing to believe, right?
Yeah. I mean, it is, like I said, it is fake, but I did want to address it because it started to crop up here, so much so that both Barbus and Strong felt the need to address it in their books, because it was a thing that was being said widely and still gets said widely about the Soviet Union. But on the flip side, here is what Stalin himself considered to be sort of the major contradictions that faced the Soviet Union. Quote, the sources of all our difficulties today are officialism and the paper administration of the social services, twaddle about the, quote, principles of leadership, end quote, instead of actual constructive leadership, the absence of personal responsibility, the lack of individuality in work, the leveling system in wages, the absence of any systemic inspection of results achieved, and the fear of self-criticism, end quote. So these are the things that Stalin himself is like, here are the actual problems that we're facing. And his solution to those issues was to have consistent and repeated political education for all members of leadership, so that the big picture is always at the forefront of everyone's mind, regardless of their individual place or their work's place within the grand project. Because he didn't want people to get fixated on, here's what I'm doing and here's what I have to do, and kind of getting entrenched in just what's right in front of them, right around them. He wanted them to make sure that they were seeing how their work connected to and how they as individuals connected to the bigger picture. Whether or not that was super successful is another question.
At the same time that this is going on in the early 30s, Stalin is writing the Constitution, right? He's like writing the new draft of the Constitution. And the purpose of it, of course, like, people think that the purpose of the Constitution and the push for membership in the mid-30s was so that Stalin could consolidate his power or whatever, and blah, 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 blah. But there's absolutely no evidence of that ever existing, certainly in Stalin's mind. But he wanted to, through the Constitution, through the admission of more membership to the party, to push a lot of youth into the party, because he could see from the readmission and the expulsion and the readmission and the expulsion of, like, these, quote unquote old Bolsheviks, that there was just like this entrenched, old, stubborn, like, they were going through the same arguments over and over again. And he knew that there needed to be leadership. The leadership, I think Ray talked about it in the Foundations of Leninism episode. There needed to be leadership that had the most revolutionary ideas leading the party. And if it was just a bunch of old people from the Civil War, then they're not the vanguard. I think another contradiction that I don't think the Soviet Union ever solved, that really rears its head in the 30s, particularly the late 30s, but it begins in the early 30s, is the existence of like the so-called Muscovites, the intelligentsia, the technical specialists that even within the Soviet Union lived kind of a more comfortable life than the general population. But they were so well connected in social circles, in the revolutionary circles of like the leadership, that it was almost impossible to persecute them, right? To purge them, to get rid of them. But at the same time, they, certainly during Stalin's era, he never wanted to play into their hand, right? So as people are getting purged, particularly or imprisoned, or they're having shortages, whatever food shortages, etc. It's these people that are in the ear of the politicians of the time, right? And so they're constantly, I guess, undermining the project as it moves forward and giving a disproportionately skewed version of the actual conditions of the Soviet population, for the vast majority of the population had improved dramatically, right? But these people, they weren't improving, and oftentimes they were going down. Their living standards were going down. I told a diary entry about the girl that had to get men's boots or whatever, right? For her, that's a frustration. For a lot of the population, they're getting boots for the first time. You know what I mean? And that kind of stuff is I think, lost in the translation. And then when Khrushchev and Brezhnev and certainly Gorbachev, they decided to placate the intelligentsia, to create more of them, to pander to them. And that whole mentality is kind of, I think, what shifted the Soviet Union towards its decline. But it was something that neither Stalin nor anyone else, I think, in my opinion, ever actually solved.
And then sort of one last example of a contradiction that happens at the very end of the period that we're covering here in 1934, because prior to that, of course, we had obviously the Revolution and World War I. We had the Volga famine. We had the death of Lenin. We had the Reconstruction following the Civil War and the Volga famine and the Revolution and World War I. And then in the 1930s, we had another famine. And so finally, in 1934, because of the success of collectivization and the success of modernization and industrialization, they finally had a surplus in 1934 where they were able to then start looking at doing more to improve the quality of life of people there in the Soviet Union, which was great. You know, they were building subways, they were improving roads, they built all sorts of stuff. I mean, we talked about it a little bit in the 5-year plan section, but all sorts of new stuff was being done. But because they were no longer in crisis, they became more aware and more interested in how the outside world viewed them. And so the story that Anna tells is that she has a friend who works at an orphanage in Moscow, and it's run so well that they make it the model orphanage. So other orphanages would come and see how they perform duties, but also this is where they would send the Western press when they wanted them to see how well they treated their orphans. And as a result, they could not allow for overcrowding. So Anna's friend is crying to her because she's like, there are all of these Ukrainian peasant children who have arrived from the West here to Moscow, and we have to turn them away because if we bring them in, our beds are full, so we can't have them sleeping on the floor because that won't be the model that we want to demonstrate. And she references her boss who was a homeless child himself in the 1910s and early 20s. And she calls him heartless because he's like, oh, don't worry about it. These kids, they're just here for the summer. When the harvest picks up, they'll head back to the Ukraine. And besides, they're here in Moscow during the summer. There's plenty of food around. They're not going to go hungry. It's more like a camping trip for them, and that makes this woman really angry. And she relays this to Anna, and Anna's like, this is a contradiction here, because there is the reality that children need a place to go to be taken care of, but the Soviet Union also needs to project an air that they've got their shit together to outsiders for the propaganda aspect of it, and certainly the man was right. The formerly homeless, now boss of this orphanage, was correct that once the summer was over and the harvest picked up again, all of these kids headed right back to Ukraine, and they had work or things that they could do to take care of themselves, or their family were able to take care of them. But that is an issue, that the image is not necessarily reflective of the reality of that situation, but also it is important for them to look good to the outside world. So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's worth noting here the Soviet Union's international relations. Not only were orphanages, for example, seen as something to be emulated in the outside world, specifically the developing universal healthcare system in the Soviet Union, known as the Semashko system, also was kind of seen as a shining light during this period. You had progressive doctors from all across the world, coming to experience and to learn about this system, to hopefully come back home and emulate it in their own countries. So specifically, I know I'm from Canada. Doctors from Canada were going there, doctors from the UK, from the US, etc. It wouldn't be until after World War II in which Western Europe would actually implement these systems, but the actual push to get there was happening in the early 30s. Also during the 30s, of course, this is the Great Depression. So you have American workers who are not only Americans, but from all across the world, coming to the Soviet Union for that, I guess, Soviet dream, you could call it, right? An opportunity to be treated like as an actual human, as a worker, not even just as a worker. Say, for example, African Americans coming to the Soviet Union to be treated as an equal person, regardless of their quote unquote race.
I think there's also an interesting contradiction, kind of to add on to what Jeremy, you were just saying before Tony said what Tony said. I think that we can see parallels today in the Scandinavian and the Nordic countries. You can think whatever you want to think about that model, but the contradiction that is always there between a part of the world that is trying in certain ways to raise the standards for childcare, for education, and then the reality of what that transition is and the way that it is perceived abroad and how it is to juggle all of that. Like the example is, again, I used to be an early childhood teacher, and in Norway and Sweden, for example, there's constantly media about how they are at a shortage of early childhood educators compared to Finland, where this doesn't come up. The reality is that the goal, the standard that Norway, for example, is moving toward is like one adult for every 3 children. Versus Finland, which has great education, but they have much higher quotas and much larger class sizes on aggregate. And so because their standard is different, it doesn't come up as a shortage. And I think that this is interesting because, as Tony mentioned, we're going through the Depression right now in the West. And so to compare these two things, it makes one look much worse than the other, when the only real reason for that materially is that, I mean, it's a problem everywhere. I'm not going to pretend like the what children and young people were facing and what their carers were facing was positive. But the only reason that it, quote unquote, looks worse in the Soviet Union is because the Soviet Union is trying to set higher standards for what should be happening for these children.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So on the subject of children and of the average people, although this really ties into Stalin more than anything, there is a pretty neat anecdote from Stalin's bodyguard that he writes about later, where he apparently, according to him, he did this kind of stuff all the time, but it says that they were traveling by car back to Moscow, and Stalin stopped the car so he could stretch or whatever. And there were some vacationers with children that were around, and Stalin told Vlasic, one of his companions, to go and get some candies in order to give the children. So Vlasic went to the a man that was running a kiosk got the candies and gave them out to the children while the parents were just talking Stalin's ear off, right? And then that night when they were like getting ready to go to bed, Stalin asked Vlasic, "Did you pay the man for the candies?" And Vlasic's like, "No, I didn't have time." And he made him return immediately to the man and pay him for the candies that he had got from the kiosk.
Nice.
So the narrative section of this episode was dense with real, direct quotes from Soviet citizens across all walks of life. And that's super cool. But do y'all have any more insight into what day-to-day life was like for the Soviet Union in the early 1930s?
Yeah. So I've got this one story that's from a large collective farm, kind of in the midst of collectivization. It was one of the early collectivized regions. And then I've got a bunch of stories about American workers being there, in addition to the one I told earlier that was related to the industrial trials. So there's this woman, Ustina, they called her the chicken woman of the quote unquote fortress of communism. It was a large collective farm not far from Filanovo. She had been a servant maid from the age of 8 prior to the revolution. And then after the revolution, she was one of the first people to be like, I want to establish a commune. So she was ready to establish a collective farm before collectivization was policy. So this was like, she was on the fucking ground floor. And basically, step by step, she and her other, they call them communards, but basically people who resided at the commune, they built up this farm, and it got larger and it got larger and it got larger. And they were given tractors and an incubator by the state. She won a prize from Moscow in recognition of her work. And then after basically 2 years of kind of doing pretty well, suddenly the crisis of the Volga famine hits, and hundreds of fucking peasants show up like, hey, can we please work here because your conditions are much better than on our own farms. And she was like, this is fine. You can come on in. And then when the kulaks start there, they started expelling people from nearby farms and basically taking them over. Another wave of peasants showed up at this collective farm. And Ustina says, quote, "It is our second war. The Great War was a murdering war." So she's talking about World War I there. "This war is not a murdering war, but it is war all the same. So we must struggle again and help all who are with us." So the mindset here, very different from what I would say is sort of the general attitude in the West, where it's like, I can only do what I can do. It's more like, we're going to do literally anything we possibly fucking can to take care of the people around us. Whatever is we are able to do, that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, I've got a few kind of, they're all diary entries because that's where I spent because I had already read so many books going into this, I spent a lot of my time going through diaries, but a lot of really interesting shit. So the first one I have is by Vladimir Moldotsov, who is a coal miner, and this is during the first 5-year plan. And he writes about his part, and this can even go back to the individualism thing or the mindless masses of the Soviets or whatever. He says, "The highest feeling that I could experience in my short life is the feeling of being conscious of the fact that I am part of the miners' collective." So even though it's a collective mindset, his own individual contribution to that is what is like where his pride comes from. There were a lot of, throughout the Spanish Civil War, there were a lot of diary entries in support, but this one in particular comes from the 1934 uprising. And Vladimir Zhelinchnikov says, "We are here with you, heroic sons, people. Fascism will be defeated." And this is after a story that he had about a dream, I guess the telling of a dream, in which he was fighting with the Spanish resistance. And then I have another one from Leonid Potemkin, who is actually like a fairly famous writer from the Soviet Union. So I don't know if it's average people, but it's still kind of like a cool story, I guess, of how people saw themselves. He wrote in his diary, "It is not by sheer chance that I am in the Institute. It is a necessary consequence of the socialist revolution, which raised us up from below and elevated us to above their heads. Our will is triumphant. Only we children of poverty and incredible hardship must and can create the new society. Only we are granted the mission of giving mankind a chance to really bloom.
Wah, wah. Yeah, so I referenced this again when I was talking about the industrial trials, but Anna Louise Strong was touring the Soviet Union. She went all over the place, the Urals to back to the Volga region, other areas of Western Russia. But at the Stalingrad Tractor Works, and again, must remind you, Stalingrad, formerly Tsaritsyn, renamed Stalingrad in 1925 because Stalin was so badass. So at the Tractor Works, she kind of found difficulty everywhere she looked. Like many of the Americans wanted to spend more time partying than working. They would smash the windows of trams so they could climb on board rather than wait in line with the locals. Like they didn't want to wait their turn. They just fucking broke the windows and climbed on board, which is very American mindset, I guess. The Russian bosses said that there were no good Americans. One of them said, quote, "You know nothing and you do nothing," end quote. Of course, this wasn't true. There were dedicated U.S. immigrants who volunteered to keep watch for their violent compatriots during their time off, like not when they were working, but on their free time. They would like sit around and watch and wait for Americans to misbehave and then report them to Soviet officials so they could be deported. Sort of, again, kind of continuing along this theme of kind of negative stuff. Experienced engineers, including a former foreman at Ford, were put in charge of extremely menial tasks. Like they were not, somebody with that much experience, you might expect them to be like the boss or like to have some kind of, to be a foreman, but they were put in charge of menial tasks. Their suggestions for improving process and efficiency often went ignored. And likely this is general distrust for Americans, fear of sabotage or whatever from external sources, because industrial sabotage was so prevalent during this time. There was a US-born foundryman who was responsible for producing flywheels, and he could see that much of the metal that was going into the mold was impure, and he literally would like throw himself in between the incoming cart of molten metal and the flywheel mold and like push it back to stop it from going in to increase the efficiency, which then did eventually give him some kind of leverage and credence with the Russian bosses who were like, oh, okay, I guess I could trust this guy. Maybe I should start listening to him. But it was a sort of a continual issue. In Kharkiv, Strong met an American who was in charge of investigating the causes of various machinery that was breaking down in steel rolling. And one time he caught pneumonia basically because he was overworking himself. And this is sort of speaking to the medical care that was available to workers here in the Soviet Union. He was assigned 2 full-time nurses and a nurse who was also an interpreter. And when he was at his worst, there was a physician who remained on call both day and night, who sat with him most of the time to make sure that he was okay. Upon recovery, he went to the Steel Trust and he begged them not to take the cost of his treatment out of his salary all at once. He was like, please let me pay in installments. And they were confused at first, and it took some like back and forth, but he eventually figured out that there was going to be no cost. And Anna Louise Strong was like, quote, he had actually supposed that a man who was saving hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Soviet Union would have to pay for illness caused by overwork. He had been used to that under capitalism, end quote, which is the case. Like it is the case here. If you overwork yourself here and you get yourself sick, that's your fucking fault. Like that's your problem. You should have taken better care of yourself and taken responsibility for yourself. But that's not the case in the Soviet Union. Kind of a little inspiring thing to close this out. In Novosibirsk, she met a man named Bill Shatov, who was from the US. He was building rail lines. He looked as though he hardly slept and he never took a day off. And Strong asked him why he hadn't brought his wife with him, had a comfortable home, took more days for himself. And he kind of stared at her incredulously for a little bit before saying, quote, the greatest thing in life is work. No, not just work. Creation. In this particular bit of time in which we live, there is the chance to create without end or limit. Do you think I could turn aside from an hour of creation for temporary comfort? End quote. And then Strong responds, quote, Bill's words thrilled me with joy, yet at times they shook me with loneliness and longing. What was the matter with me? What was the matter with all of us Americans that we couldn't quite connect with this creation? All of us could see from the chaos in which we worked that somebody, somehow, all around us, only not quite where we were, was making a world, end quote. And that was another issue. Like, she goes around and she talks to all these Americans and they're like, we don't understand. Everything is so inefficient here. They paid us all this money to come over here, and then we train people and they get good at the job. And then once they get good at the job, they take them away and make them foremen to teach other people. And then they bring new people in who suck, and we got to teach them again. And it's just over and over and over and over, because all they are focused on is their narrow little window into what they're doing. They can't see that they are a part of this greater project, of this creation, of this worker state, of this development of something larger than themselves. And that's kind of what she's saying here, is like, this one American gets it, but why can't I, or why can't these other Americans understand that they are creating something brand new?
All right, last question here. A lot of your narrative focused on the conditions and circumstances within the USSR itself. What was the international context with which the Soviet Union was dealing at this time?
Well, what we're seeing now, kind of in the early 30s, is the start of people going neither reaction nor revolution, which is, third way bullshit. Like, eventually this morphs into neither Washington nor Moscow, but it begins as neither reaction nor revolution, which is just nonsense. They're like the original radical centrists. But the world is sliding into fascism everywhere. The parliamentary system is being swept away, and of course, Jewish people and socialists are being blamed so that the bourgeoisie can avoid responsibility for the crises they created. So when Strong she's headed on like a speaking tour in the US, but she travels west and stops in Nazi Germany on her way out. And she's met by this German American from New Orleans who was the Nazi press liaison for the English-speaking reporters. And she says to him, quote, "The world is telling atrocity stories about you. I'm not interested in atrocities. Every regime puts down its enemies as roughly as it has to. I want to know what you are doing to pull Germany out of chaos," end quote. And he kind of gets flustered and upset because he wasn't prepared for actual policy questions. He was prepared to deny atrocities, to be like, oh no, that's not happening, this bad stuff that you've heard, it's not real. But he says that they are tackling unemployment by putting people to work on building a highway system separate from the existing one, except all of the young people that they are hiring to do this have to sleep in tents. They are provided no work clothing, and they are not paid for the work that they are doing. To which Strong replies, quote, "I see. Great military highways built by slave labor. Well, that's one thing. What's next?" End quote. So then he's like, oh, well, we're closing the East Prussian border with Poland and Lithuania so that seasonal workers can't cross over, and they are demanding that landowners hire German workers. But to subsidize this, the state was taking the unemployment payments that they were previously giving to these people and paying them directly to the landlords because of the increased cost of labor for hiring Germans as opposed to poor Polish and Lithuanian people. He says, quote, "This has lessened our unemployed by many tens of thousands," end quote. And to which Strong replies, quote, "It has lessened your lists," which is, of course, good propaganda, "but has it lessened your outlay for unemployment doles?" End quote. And the Nazi says, quote, "Well, no, it costs as much as before. We're saving costs by taking women and Jews off the rolls. But the scheme in East Prussia is good in another way. It keeps these men from congregating in the city where they only stir up trouble," end quote. And Strong thinks to herself, quote, "Yes, they use state funds to make farmhands the slaves of landlords. That's another way," end quote. Barbusse's perspective on fascism and his analysis is unfucking real because it's so prescient. He's got such a great materialist perspective. So, quote, "It achieves nothing. Fascism is not and never will be anything but a veneer, and the only really imaginative or original things that fascists have ever done have been to decide upon the color of their shirts and to persuade the people that one can live on smoke. It still remains that form of society in which one only prospers in proportion as one ruins someone else. in which one only lives by killing other people. That form of society which invades new continents in order to steal weak countries and to make the natives pay for the very air they breathe. That abject form of society in which one cannot be honest without being a fool, where the elections violate the will of the people, where men exploit each other, assassinate each other, and the payment of all great social debts is indefinitely postponed by elusive appearances of settlement, and the people are perpetually dancing over a concealed volcano. Such a system cannot possibly put an end to the crisis. It produces nothing except, perhaps, a death sentence. The order proclaimed by bourgeois rule is that of the cemetery. What can be the outcome of it all? Only war. And once more, we shall have snout-like gas masks, trainloads of soldiers, hearses full of living men, masses of people rushing headlong to get themselves killed, fields turned into heaps of scrap metal, villages into stone heaps, and whole peoples asphyxiated in subterranean prisons. So, end quote there. He actually uses the term concentration camps here. He says the people of the world are in concentration camps. France is selling tanks and raw materials to make munitions to Germany itself. China and Japan induced a mutual munitions supplier to lower prices so that they could more cheaply produce weapons. Both Mussolini and Hitler had already begun butchering and imprisoning socialists. He's even able to predict which side each country is going to fall on when the war breaks out, because he's like, fascism cannot deliver on its promises, so the only way that they can produce the outcomes they want is to go to war, which is, of course, what fucking happens. Because, again, this book is published in 1935. Hitler didn't even annex Czechoslovakia until 1939. This is we are years away from World War II, and he is already predicting it. He thinks that the Spanish Republic is going to turn fascist because of what Justin mentioned there, the failed revolution of 1934. It was the Republican government that puts it down. He says that Oswald Mosley is out there doing his thing in Britain, but he rightly argues that the workers are too well organized in Britain for fascism to really take hold. He thinks that the French are going to fall to fascism because even though they're not electing fascist leaders, they keep talking about and making these weird overtures to nationalist development. He talks about Japan expanding into Manchuria and what is now Chengde. It's kind of desperate to control the Pacific, but at the time it's being kept in check by the Five Powers Treaty of 1921, which meant that their naval force had to be kept at a lower proportion to the U.S. In the U.S., Roosevelt is trying to walk this line of practical solutions to the global depression while maintaining dictatorship of capital. But yeah, basically, Barbus says, quote, "War is the only recourse for Hitler, who has no constructive program. As soon as he feels himself sufficiently armed and sufficiently supplied with allies, he will cast off his mask. Never has any country been so inevitably dragged towards disaster." Again, 1935. He later says, quote, "There are two worlds, the socialist world and the capitalist world. Between the two hovers the absurd mirage of a third world, democratic in name, but feudal in fact. The greatest and most important reply to the exigencies of the times must certainly come from the youth. It is not for youth to bring its driving force to bear on degrading traditions, nor to make a desperate attempt to turn the world from the left to the right. It is for the youth to do something new, according to the dictates of nature and science. The boy is the father to the man, and the future belongs to him." End quote. So that's, again, this is all kind of the context of what the Soviet Union is having to deal with, is this rising trend of fascism, of imperialist Japan invading right on their border. It is a prelude, I suppose, to the worst things that come. We're going to be covering a lot of it in the next section, and even more so when we cover the Great Patriotic War. But it's like this boiling pot that the Soviet Union is sitting inside of, surrounded on all sides, basically, by enemies.
Yeah, and it's at the same time what's happening in the U.S., I guess that affects Russia greatly, is the passing of what was called the Johnson Act, which is actually in response to what Britain did in kind of creating the collapse of 1929 by removing themselves from the gold standard and all that kind of shit. Yeah, so anyway, the Johnson Act basically made it law that American businesses could not make loans to foreign governments that still owed the United States money. And this was a serious issue for Russia because they are trying. So Roosevelt is trying to, I guess, kind of court the Soviet Union as an ally against Japan. But in order for them to do that, they need to, the Soviet Union wants money, right? They're in the throes of the end of the first 5-year plan, which was like by and large, a smashing success. And they're moving into the second 5-year plan, and they would like money to invest in, reconstruction, or I guess construction at this point. But the U.S. won't allow businesses to sell to the Soviet Union, but they will sell to Germany. And because the Kerensky government, I just want to say Krestinsky, which is like one of the people that gets purged, but Kerensky government took out loans from the U.S. Of, I believe it was $100 million or something. And so they wanted the Soviet government to pay these loans back. And they're like, nah. I mean, if you think about it, the Kerensky government was in power for so little that probably most of that money got stolen and taken out of the country when like everything fell apart. So they're in constant negotiations with the representatives from the United States and directly with Roosevelt. And the whole time, it's kind of funny because I read like probably 100 cables back and forth between like the American representative about what he was talking about and either Roosevelt's representative or Roosevelt himself. And they are essentially trying to play the Soviet Union. Like they want us so bad that they'll eventually buckle and give us a big chunk of cash. And that ends up biting them in the ass because when they're getting close to a negotiation, Stalin's like, we've already got all the contracts for the second 5-year plan, so we don't need your fucking money anymore. And then that was like the end of the discussions. And then right after that is when the U.S. is like, all right, fine, we'll acknowledge you diplomatically anyway, which I thought was kind of funny. And then obviously the 1931 invasion of Manchuria was tipped off by spies. So Japanese spies in the Soviet government claimed that they had documents saying that the Soviets were going to take the railway that the Japanese owned. And that was their pretext for the invasion. And, they had long, of course, wanted some kind of base on the mainland. They were trying to get off of their island. So they ended up invading Manchuria. And that's basically the beginning of World War II, although we don't really think of it like that.
These threats that both of you have talked about now, it's very clear from the record that Stalin and the Soviet government took them seriously. So like, say, for example, further to what Justin said about the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, which happened in 1931, ended in 1932. So what that did is that placed Japan right on the border of the Soviet state. And of course, it's an obvious threat for invasion being right up against the border of a state that you want to see dismantled. But what we do know from, intelligence that's been released since then is that it was in 1932, right when this invasion had been completed, that Japanese intelligence started right away in encouraging subversion in Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, using dissidents in those regions, most likely dissidents which had, united against the collectivization and rapid industrialization attempts at that time. And we also know at this time that Japan was allying their subversion attempts with Estonia and Finland too, in alliance with Russian emigres in those countries. In order to counter the threat from Nazi Germany, we know that Maxim Litvinov, who was the foreign minister and of course a close ally to Stalin, they started working right away in 1933 after the Nazis came to power on a collective security plan to make with both Britain, France, and really any other Western country that would join in as a sort of an anti-Hitler pact, because they were quite aware from really all of the rhetoric that Hitler had put out, even going back all the way to Mein Kampf, that he was dead set on dismantling the Soviet Union, destroying communism, and enslaving Slavic peoples and exterminating the Jews. And that's something that we're going to get into a lot more depth on in the next episode, which is going to cover really the lead up to World War II.
That about does it for this episode of the Stalin Eras. We want to thank all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones are Food Stamp, Luke, Hasty Zircon, Ab Weichung, Cyborg Penguin, Kevin, Sean, Melortles, Garrett, Old Left, Brandon, A Gardener, Christian, Rowan, Yair, Dirty Crook, Johnny Hammersickle, Pinko Scum, Ron, Vic Vinegar, Tyler, Simple Marxist, Alex, Hannah, Kyle, Comrade Benjamin, Kareem, Matt, Timothy, Ethics, Seaferb, Morphine Stick, and Austin. And a special shout out to our only Vanguard subscriber, Comrade Chihuahua. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/Prolespod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolespod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, like, all that algorithm stuff, and we'll see you next week. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
A mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. And he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the workers' state the best the world has ever seen.